Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti Federalists, they absolutely had it correct. And they always were referring back to a moral republic, a moral people. The, I got to be honest with you, is that America went through those turns and dips and transitions in history where there was a great unawakening, a depression of even morality in New England colonies. That's why when the Great Awakening occurred, that happened there in the early 1700s, it was meaningful to bring us to the point of the American Revolution. It was necessary because there's no way to really understand liberty. There's no way to take and bring that into good governance without that awakening to the truth of the biblical Reformation, the living God, and understanding the full essence of his sovereignty in all things. I'm starting out that way because, as you may already be aware, this past week, the Senate, and as it is in reconciliation, and by the time that this actually gets published, the House may have re-voted on that thing that is called some kind of Radical Respect for Marriage Act. So I want to start off in just reading to you what I wrote in the preface for the blog this week, as well as an email response, which I do not have in there, but I want to bring it to your attention as we try to understand what are the possibilities, what are those efforts that can now go forward besides repentance. That's the biggest thing, is that we all have to repent. So with that, as I titled this program as a global reset being the economics of two religions, by definition, economics, we'll get into what Sowell says about economics and the definition of economics, but the real point of the simplicity in a definition of economy and economics is the lack of something. So right now we are lacking in moral leadership, in people that understand their oath of office and that it means something before a sovereign God. So with that, notwithstanding this discussion on the economics of two religions, I have to note the deeper damnation of these United States are being put under due to codifying immorality once again. This past Tuesday, the U.S. Senate presumably completed the passage of the Radical Respect for Marriage Act. And there's a link there that you can go to, an article referencing that. And then see also the USA article, Senate passes landmark legislation protecting same-sex marriage rights, and there's a whole recap of it. Now, this law fully uses Article 4, Section 1, the full faith and credit clause, and the Obergefell ruling, which misuses the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Now, we know that SCOTUS took an immoral position in 2015 with the Obergefell versus Hodges, which my state here in Ohio was one of the petitioning states in that case. Now, SCOTUS ruled against the citizens and constitutions of Ohio, Michigan, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And the reason I say that and I wrote that is because in Ohio, we clearly have in our Constitution, and it is in Article 15. Article 15 clearly states in Section 11 that only a union between one man and one woman may be a marriage valid in or recognized by this state. Recognized is key. in the case. It and its political subdivisions. That means nowhere in the state of Ohio is marriage recognized other than one man, one woman, period. And it doesn't matter if somebody gets married in any other state that they take, and that's a violation. This state and its political subdivisions shall not create or recognize illegal statuses for relationships of unmarried individuals that intends to approximate the design, qualities, significance, or effect of marriage. Obergefell basically threw that out. And in the bill that is there, just in the summary alone, the bill takes and it changes the definition of marriage between a man and a woman and spouse as a person of the opposite sex with provisions that recognize any marriage that is valid under state law. So if some state allows same-sex marriage, then it is being forced by virtue of Section 4 of the federal Constitution that it has to be recognized everywhere. And so the bill repeals and replaces provisions that do not require states to recognize same-sex marriage from other states with provisions that prohibit the denial of full faith and credit or any right or claim relating to out-of-state marriages on the basis of sex, race, ethnicity, and national origin. So it even covers the child stuff for the radical Islams. So they use in here the Supreme Court case on same-sex marriages barring some same-sex marriages were unconstitutional, and they used Obergefell versus Hodges in 2015, and that the state held that laws barring interracial marriages were unconstitutional based on a 1967 case, Loving versus Virginia. The bill allows the Department of Justice to bring a civil action and establish a private right of action for violations. Very severe, very severe. So there's a lot of analysis that is still coming out. The email that I received in respect to that is that this will go again to the Supreme Court because the way that the court ruled in the Defense and Against the Defense of Marriage Act is that the court says that the government cannot pass laws protecting natural marriage because that is a state issue, and that we will be connecting with other counsel to be able to determine what will be the next steps in this regard. So I think that it's very critical that we understand that that's all part of economy in so many different ways, and there's a lot of economic issues that are tied to this. So with this immoral law soon to become reality, the question of two religions goes well beyond economics. In this week's program, I give you a strong provocation regarding modern economics is morally determined by the statist, including most evangelicals. When we look at this, and when I try and get into this more, which again, I'm going to run out of time, is that most evangelicals approve of and participate in the theories of the statist when it comes to economy and economics in general. So even evangelicals, other churches, Catholic Church, Jewish religious people, instead of being morally determined by God-centered worldview thinkers and policymakers, it's by these people that are globalist, statist, the people that do not have a moral accountability before the living God. So one last statement here, and then we'll move on. Just remember that morality can be and is legislated. The question is, whose and which morality? That's always the question. Well, let's just jump over in the last few minutes here into the economics of two religions. So when I start looking at this global reset and what does that mean, I once again admit that I'm several decades late in coming into the depth of it, and that great writers like Thomas Sowell, Gary North, and several others have delved into this back in the 70s and the 80s in particular. And yet what we generalize everything down to is what I want to talk from both Gary North, a little bit from Thomas Sowell, and as well we'll be touching on Abraham Kuyper, is that when we look at the economics of two religions, is that it gets a general sense of what happens in the field of economics when rival religions clash, that of power religion and dominion religion. And where I'm extracting that comparison from is Gary North's book called Moses and Pharaoh, and looking at Exodus and the analysis that he does, the commentary, the political economy commentary that he does on Exodus. Absolutely brilliant. He brings in and ties in concepts on even Egyptology that I've never read before, quite frankly. And again, this book was done decades ago, and I'm just reviewing it now. So this being played out, and we're seeing it played out, and we saw it played out, and putting it in the proper tense, out at the Sinai Desert, while all of these different folks were attending that global COP27 climate conference. So there were a number of religious leaders that were out there as well, and they were awaiting. They were standing on what they believed to be Mount Sinai, waiting for the new 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments that include climate change. They're looking to the climate gods. There was even one rabbi up there that took copies written in stone of the 10 Commandments given in Exodus and threw them down and symbolically broke them, expecting this new climate God-given 10 Commandments. So if you've not followed that, go to the references. There's some articles there, all established within the concept of the UN. Then as I look at the humanistic atheism and what that is really all about on a global economic religion, is that there's an article there on Klaus Schwab proclaimed that communist China will likely serve as a role model for many countries as the global community embarks upon a systematic transformation of the world. So when we take the World Economic Forum, they are a religious group. They are a humanist, atheistic religious group promoting heavily all of the climate culture, the climate religion, and all of that. So when we look at how then they have been able to push, even in these United States, that climate bill that Biden is so proud of, we see there that it is a relationship in those economies, the economics, and how that relates between liberty and religion. And that it's really the dung pile of the Pharaoh, the dung pile of Egypt, because the scarab of Egyptian religious symbology is a dung pile beetle. A little humor there if you don't get that. So there is levity intended. And as we come back to the next segment of Samuel Adams Returns, those anti-federalists got it right, we're going to be able to get into really some of the arguments all the way back into 1890s as for religion in economics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this second segment of Samuel Adams Returns, those anti-federalists. They did. They got it right. This is Tom Navolis. You know, it was economics as one of the primary issues that our founders actually fought over. What was going on with removing the ability to manufacture, removing the ability to have a fair market environment. That was a problem. That was a problem with England and all of the globalists of that day being part of, you guessed it, none other than the East India Trading Company, taking and ensuring that they were taking and fighting against all that was good for America, wanting to take and ensure that they had everything that they wanted and that they would enslave us as a people. So no different than what was happening there in Egypt and with Israel when it went down to Egypt and became a party to all of what occurred over time, especially when the religion of Pharaoh became so dominant in overtaking that of Israel, and the people becoming complacent because they did not remember who the sovereignty of God was and is and should be. So they were okay being slaves. They were okay with it, really. They moaned, they groaned, all of that. No different than what we have had in America, no different than what we have right now. And so with that, we see that there are those problems that are going on with America from the same perspective, and that when we look at the economics in America right now, it is being led by those that have a moral bent towards their humanism and thinking that they are greater than God and solving all of the problems of the world. That's part of the World Economic Forum, that they can run it all. So the new Pharaoh, if you will, or pharaohs, if you will. So with that, let's go here and look back in 1890, and that we can seriously ascertain that religion in economics. So Alfred Marshall argued back then that the two great forming agencies of world's history have been the religious and the economic. And he wrote that in Principles of Economics. So with that in mind, and as we dive deeper into what Gary North wrote on the difference between Pharaoh and Moses and the two religions and what does that mean, we also have to look at, from a more modern time in the late 1800s, early 1900s with Kuyper, and what is political economy. So it wasn't economics per se historically. It was always political economy. So economics became this science later in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and didn't mature until the 1900s. So what we're really trying to grasp and understand is that difference between economy, which I say the looking at economy has overshadowed liberty, and what does that mean for us as individuals and then as a society. So drawing into this is that Anthony Randazzo and Jonathan Haidt back in 2015 presented significant evidence that in fact economists, quote, value judgments permeate economics. They came up unequivocally being able to show that. They concluded by asserting that value-free economics is no more likely to exist than in the fictionless world of high school physics problems. Pretty interesting. That's pretty powerful. So when we look at that, we might argue that the shortfalls of rational choice theory, as pointed out by a couple other economists, Kahneman and Tversky, that you can't apply the whole idea that there is such a thing as value-free economics. They too make a decision about what to study, how to study, and we're talking about economists. When you go into classes for economics, guess what? You are persuaded, you're lumped into this brain meld, this mind meld of what to study, how to study it, and how to judge the things based on personal preferences and commitments in addition to self-interest. So what we have in the end run here is that economics in so many different ways, without looking purely at the numbers in relationship to it, is irrational, shrewdly irrational. No such thing as value-free economics. So we take a look and try to bring that all back then to the idea, well, what's Thomas Sowell talking about in relationship to that? Well, I wanted to interject here in his book, which I opened up with a number of weeks ago, more than a month ago now, on Basic Economics, A Citizen's Guide to the Economy, is that, once again, he states from John Adams that facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclination, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. John Adams said that, or wrote that at least. So when we want to know what is economics, economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. That's how Thomas Sowell takes and defines economics. Economics, when you look at it, we must first know what an economy is. Perhaps most of us think of an economy as a system for the production and distribution of goods and services we use in everyday life. This is true as far as it goes, but it does not go far enough. Sowell says this: the Garden of Eden was a system for the production and distribution of goods and services, but it was not an economy because everything was available in unlimited abundance without scarcity. There is no need to economize and therefore no economics. So this is it. It is what is scarce. Where are the limitations in the resources? That way, you have to economize. So all of us live with some sense of economy. We live with it from a perspective of what is scarce for us. And that way we determine how we are going to utilize what we do have or make attempts to acquire that which is scarce, and the rationale as to why we even need it, or ultimately why we do not need it. Economics, in many ways, can be manipulated, especially when it comes to the socialist pattern, the statist pattern, that whole idea that humanists bring, where they think they are God and they can determine best what it is that you or I should have, how we should spend our money, how we should eat bugs instead of beef, how we should take and not drive gas-powered vehicles, but in all effect, not drive at all. Get out of the vehicles. Hey, go Amish. But then you can't go Amish and drive horse and buggies because you're polluting the atmosphere with horses. Oh, on and on it goes. So it is then it becomes economic, politics, economic politics. And that was the beginning of the study of economics back in the 1700s. So Thomas Sowell asked the question, what does scarce mean? It means that what everybody wants adds up to more than what there is. So this may seem like a simple thing, but its implications are often grossly misunderstood, even by highly educated people. So I want to finish off this section with Thomas Sowell and a transition back to the bondage that people and nations have come to accept in economics, allowing economics to be managed for them with no morality. No such thing. Remember, as I said, there's no such thing as valueless economics. There's always some kind of value system, morality attached to it. So Sowell, once again, and this whole idea, and then as we move into the third segment, is to get the gray matter working. I want your gray matter to really get working for you, and that the thoughts of the non-economic value system. Sowell writes this. He goes, while economics offers many insights and makes it easier to see through some popular notions that sound good but will not stand up under the scrutiny, economics has also acquired the name the dismal science because it pours cold water on many otherwise attractive and exciting but fallacious notions about how the world can be arranged. One of the last refuges of someone whose pet project or theory has been exposed as economic nonsense is to say, and here's a quote, economics is all very well, but there are also non-economic values to consider, end quote. Presumably, these are supposed to be higher and nobler concerns that soar above the level of crass materialism. Of course, there are non-economic values. In fact, there are only non-economic values. Economics is not a value in and of itself. It is only a way of weighing one value against another. But what we see so often, and we'll pick up on this remaining in bondage idea because we are, and that's why we have all of these policies and these immoral activities that happen from our political leaders because of the manipulation of businesses wanting to get a leg up and partner, which I call fascism, when government and business partner together and determine policy and how everyone else will live in relationship to those policies that they define. Well, now we have, and what we see here is that values and morality are injected into economic, political systems by policy. Policy that is derived from a humanistic perspective is Pharaoh-centric economics. That is the economics that we talked about that differentiates from what biblical economics or moral economics talks about when we look at a political economy and how that works. So there's just a lot that we take into consideration. This is a lot that the founders took into consideration at the very beginning. And we have to clearly understand that difference between the power economics of Pharaoh and his system, and then the biblical economics of God. And what does that mean in just the way that we look to liberty above the greater economy run by a government? Now, does that mean that there isn't a larger perspective of buying and selling and wants, needs of a general system? There is. But God had a plan for that as to how we're supposed to take care of our fellow men and women. Come on back in the next segment. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists did get it absolutely correct. And this is Tom Navolis, your host. And I'm delighted that you're staying with me through this third segment as we look at the political economy and what is going on from that historical perspective, and looking at it from the religion, the two religions that are ultimately holding on to the power structure of what's going on. You know, we can talk about humanism, statism, we talk about environmentalism, all of the various isms that I always define as the other religion, the power religion that is not the religion of the biblical sovereign God of all creation. Now, I did mention a little bit more about Thomas Sowell there in the last section and his perspective on even the Garden of Eden and how that related to economics and what that definition of economics is. Now, I do want to get into remaining in bondage, which it's amazing to me is that as much as we civilized Westerners, Americans in particular, talk about our liberties and freedoms, our preference is to be in bondage. No different than Israel's preference was to be in bondage. And then when Pharaoh was being challenged by Moses to let the people go, let God's people go, they necessarily didn't want to go. I mean, they thought they wanted to go, and then after they left, they wanted to go back into bondage. And, you know, you can parallel that so much within the context of these United States. Look at this last election, albeit some of it was presumably stolen, again, based on how the election system worked or didn't work in Arizona in particular. But I did want to talk about and interject here in this section of the remaining in bondage of the two religions. I did want to bring up some bits and pieces of Bastiat even, who I like Bastiat. You know, I talk about the law, but he also wrote essays on political economy. So that's how it was being addressed even back in the 1850s as political economy. So I want to give you another interesting quote from Gary North, and I think that you will hopefully appreciate this as we ponder this whole idea of people willing to remain in bondage. So Gary North wrote this: "Most amusingly, one of these interventionists has accused me of holding Enlightenment ideas." Now, you have to remember that the interventionists that he's talking about are Christian evangelicals who are economists, and they fall into the world system of economics and not the biblical view system of the sovereignty of God. And he continues then with this, is that and he gives a reference here is Ronald Sider, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger. That's the book and the people that were accusing. So this Ronald Sider was accusing Gary North of holding Enlightenment ideas. But these people not realizing that he and his associates are the true heirs of the dominant Enlightenment tradition, the tradition which exists and exalts the state. When these radical Christian critics think Enlightenment, they think Adam Smith. They obviously do not understand the Enlightenment. When we look at the historical results of the Enlightenment, we should think French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. We should think the glorification of the state. But this individualistic tradition barely survived the revolutionary and statist Enlightenment heritage. What the successful bearers of the torch of the Enlightenment did was to set Europe on fire in the name of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Why aren't we hearing that today? They're taking and bringing in that socialism. They're bringing in all of this on, yes, true liberty from the socialistic perspective, the fraternity of mankind, and equality for all. Right. That burned Europe down. That's why it's the disaster that it is. North continues, James Billington's book has described it well. Fire in the Minds of Men, which was written in 1980. It was the left wing of the Enlightenment which triumphed. When men defy mankind, they almost always wind up defying the state, the highest collective of mankind. That's the state, the highest collective. That's totality of humanism. The apotheosis of man's power. They become adherents of the power religion. So that includes all of the evangelicals that are out there as well. So let's leave this section. Let's ponder Bastiat and look at it with that which is seen and which is not seen, is one of the essays that he wrote. And he goes this way. He wrote this, and I'm just taking a snippet of it. And there's a link there at samueladamsreturns.net where you can get the whole essay and all the other essays as well. Bastiat writes, in the Department of Economy, an act, a habit, an institution, a law gives birth not only to an effect, but to a series of effects. Of these effects, the first only is immediate. It manifests itself simultaneously with its cause. It is seen. The other unfold in succession. They are not seen. It is well for us if they are foreseen. Between a good and a bad economist, this constitutes the whole difference. The one takes account of the visible effect. The other takes account of both the effects which are seen and also of those which it is necessary to foresee. Now, the difference is enormous, for it is almost always happens that when the immediate consequence is favorable, the ultimate consequences are fatal, and the converse. Hence it follows that the bad economist pursues a small present good which will be followed by a great evil to come, while the true economist pursues a great good to come at the risk of a small present evil. Very interesting in our situation today, what we're seeing in the passage of all of this globalism, the passage of all of this environmental nonsense. We're already living through many of the repercussions, the unintended consequences of Oberfell, the unintended consequences of many immoral laws that have been foisted upon us since before Jimmy Carter. Go back to Clinton. Go back, as Gary North was talking about, Roosevelt. Yeah, a lot of it there. Go back to, yes, go back and back and back. And we can see that even in economics, the greater good was a fantasy. The good for the greater good was a fantasy. And the consequences were never looked at. So in the last 5 minutes, I guess you want to know some solutions to the economics of two religions. Well, I have to take and tell you, you're going to have to watch a program in that is put on at Canon Press. It's called Man Rampant, and the title of this particular one is called Education and Kingmaking. It most certainly comes down to the Christian paideia. And what's that? I wasn't sure until I watched that program what that was. And the simple definition comes from Ephesians 6:4, which in this section of Man Rampant comes out to be, and the way that it's brought forward in that verse is the process of inculturation. The process of inculturation, the process through which a youngster was insinuated into the customs and beliefs of his people. So I look at inculturation has to be inculcation, that hammering in of how a youngster learns the customs and beliefs of your people. Now, this hasn't happened in America for over a century, especially with the way that immigration has happened. And within the last 50 years in particular, we have not been making Americans. People coming here want to garner all that there is from America under constitutionalism, but don't want to be Americans by being inculcated in the culture of America, inculcated in the customs and beliefs of America. Now, I had to dig deeper on this, since we know that our present educational system is forcing godless world religion of Pharaoh ordered upon our children. To help you out, here's a solid link that takes the Greek word in its full context for you to act upon. And I have the link there to paideia. Okay, so what's that got to do with the solution for economics here? And the two religions that I've been talking about. And the first is clearly, which is known as Christians have resigned themselves to be breeders for the secularists. That's the problem. That goes back to what I was talking about and what's talked about in Man Rampant in particular, which was surprising. I thought that was such an amazing comment that Christians really, because we have taken on, and instead of holding to the biblical worldview and fighting for it and making it work, backed off and resigned themselves to just go along with some kind of Christian word, biblical sugarcoating, and not fighting for what is truth. And so therefore I like that. Christians have resigned themselves to be breeders for secularists. Go along to get along, as long as, oh, wait a minute, what did they just pass that I talked about in the first segment? Therefore, the necessity is for clear work of God to return those who call themselves Christians to a factual and coherent biblical worldview that truly has contextual biblical foundations. Look, folks, like it or not, without a starting point admitting that God is sovereign over all things, humanity, and political economics, if you bow to the power religion of Pharaoh, you're sunk. You cannot bow to Pharaoh's power religion, to power economics, to all the immorality that is going into place right now. I think the best thing you can do is start to learn how nullification works and fight really hard within your state. And as I talked about at the very beginning, what that means. Sam Adams' wisdom, I kind of deferred over here to the 1828 definition of economy. An economy is primarily the management, regulation, and government of a family or the concerns of a household. This is what our founders understood. A frugal and judicious use of money, that management which expends money to advantage incurs no waste. Sam Adams was very economic because he didn't have a lot of money. Folks, what it comes down to is, what do you really believe? What is your worldview? And are you willing to fight for it? Are you going to give in? Or are you going to give in to the what? The political energy that's there. Come on back next week when Sam Adams returns and the Anti-Federalists got it right.